Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from ItalianGenealogy.blog, and I'm here with Jacqueline Jannotta, who's going to talk to us a little bit about her research with her family and also her blog, Becoming Better People. And she's also the author of a book, Let's Leave the Country. So welcome, Jacqueline. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's great. And I know you're out in Portland, and we talked about it a little bit offline, but I know the smoke is bad and everything, but everybody's with you, I'm sure, and hoping that it clears up very soon.
Yeah, we're sealed up in the house with our daughters doing online school and the new reality for 2020. You know how that goes.
Yeah, no, I understand. Everything's very, very strange.
Yeah.
So I'd like to start with your family, your Italian family, and how and why and when you started doing research.
Sure. Well, my family immigrated to Chicago. My dad's side is entirely Southern Italian, well, Abruzzo, Molise. And my mom is half Italian from Northern Italy and then the other half other European. And they met in Chicago. And we moved when I was about 4 to South Florida. And I was ripped away from the extended Italian family. And that's where I was, wait a minute, who am I? Where do I come from? What are my roots? And so as a young adult, I got into genealogy and discovered all kinds of things like where we were from and all that stuff. So yeah, my dad's from a small village near Isernia in Molise, and his mom was from a small village at the bottom of Abruzzo, Castel di Sangro. And then my mom, who really didn't know much about her Italian side because they became American very fast. They came from Chicago to Chicago, in the 1880s, 1890s, and immediately wanted to be American. So she really didn't know much about her history, but her grandfather was from a town called Bardi, which is near Parma and Piacenza. And her grandmother was from a town outside of Genoa, which is where we lived for a year, coincidentally, which is why I wrote the book. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. So you're the first person that I've interviewed from Molise, and I never knew that I had any family there. I didn't know at the time that that's where Capricato was, which is where my grandmother's father's family is from. And my grandmother's would be her great grandmother was the Duchess of Capricata. And I had no clue until I started doing that research. And we were actually supposed to be there in April, and it got canceled. We're hoping to go now in May. And they had a whole thing. We were going to go to the town hall, and the town hall was actually their home.
Oh, cool.
Like I said, you're the first person from there, from at least that region. And I think one of the exciting things about Italy, and you could probably talk much more about it since you live there, is that there's 20 regions and they're all vastly different.
Oh, even to the town. I mean, it's not just
Really?
the regions. Yeah, it's wild in terms of recipes, in terms of language, everything like that. In fact, when you say capricotta, it means cooked goat.
Yes.
But one of my little adventures during our year was to visit my grandmother's village, Castel di Sangro, and we went in. I had met a woman online, and her mother was from Capricotta. And so, Abruzzo and Molise used to be one giant region, Abruzzo e Molise. And so, all these towns are so close to each other. But I think my grandmother's village is near your village.
Oh, so that's pretty cool. I mean, it looks like a really nice place because I know it's up in the mountains.
Yeah.
And I think they have skiing, if not there, very nearby. And it looks very beautiful. I, looking at the pictures in the winter, how great it is. And it seems like that during the kingdom of the two Sicilies is that while everybody had their little fiefdom wherever they were all in Naples. And they would travel to the fiefdoms to collect the taxes or, check on the crops or whatever that they did. which again, I never knew. I just thought my father's family was from Naples, and that was that. My mom's family, they were farmers from Bari, and um, everybody was a farmer or a seamstress until I finally came across somebody. I think he was a forest ranger, and I was like, oh, finally.
Yeah, I had that with a shoemaker, finally, other than contadino or, yeah, exactly. So have you, I'm just curious, of your family, have you done DNA? Are you really from Spanish roots? The kingdom of, like the Naples?
Well, I've done DNA, and you probably know, every year or year and a half, they start
Oh, change it, yeah.
the thing and everything changes. And I had it with Ancestry, and then I lost it, and then it just came back yesterday, the Spanish and the French, and Northern Italy, which was interesting because from researching the records, I knew that I had the Spanish heritage. I had some French going way back to Capes and all of that. But my great grandmother's mom was from Lucerne, Switzerland. So in this iteration of Ancestry, it actually shows Northern Italy, but when they show it on the map, it's Northern Italy and Southern Switzerland. And they were from Lucerne. She was from Lucerne. And I never thought I would find anything on her. And I was online one day just scrolling around and searching, and I came across a book that had the officers of the Neapolitan army listed. And in that book, I found her father was a captain in the Swiss Guard assigned to Naples. And I had no idea. I thought the Swiss Guard guards the Pope, right? But apparently, Lucerne especially would send mercenaries to all the kingdoms of Europe. And he was in the Neapolitan army. And my great-great-grandfather was a cavalry officer in the Neapolitan army. So they must have been familiar. They must have met. And that's how I wound up with a Swiss great-grandmother.
Oh, interesting. Oh, I'll have to look into that. We have rumors of a Swiss Guard in my family tree as well, but I've never known how to prove that or not prove that.
Well, I think I have it saved someplace, and I'll see if I can find that book. And also, after I found that, I went out to I found a website that said, if you have any questions about Swiss genealogy, write us in Italian, English, or German, and we'll answer you. So I said, well, my great-great-grandmother was Moor, and I think her father was this, and do you have any information on it? And they sent me a link to all the notable family trees in Lucerne. And there, sure enough, they were there. So I was able to bring her back to the 1400s. So you lived there, you were doing this research. What did you find that was so amazing in your family?
I don't know that I found any new aha. Well, I did, but it would be so complicated to go into. But I had all these adventures by just being able to walk into the villages. And so, for instance, when I was in Castel di Sangro in Abruzzo near your village, the librarian there showed us, talked to us and shared, little stuff that she knew. And the library was named after one of my ancestors. And she brings me into the back room and she whips out this book from the 1700s that had this beautiful calligraphy of every surname, like in the town at the time. And I'm taking pictures, and it's a treasure. And what's interesting is you could tell that there were certain families that had been there for a long time and other ones that moved there. And so I knew my grandmother's surname was a newer name. So that offered a little bit of a clue. So now with a cousin, we've gone down the path of why DNA testing to figure out the roots, the origins. And it looks like maybe that was Eastern Europe, so it's just, you get like a little further and you get a clue, and then kind of where the next foothold up the mountain should be. So it's more like that, but there were no definitive ahas. And a little story from that library is I come home all excited to look at my pictures, and none of them took. And it was like, oh my God, heart crushing. And it's like one of these days I want to go back with technology that works. I was like new on the iPad. I didn't know what I was doing. So it's like, if fair warning to anyone who does a research trip, make sure your technology works, because it's heartbreaking when it doesn't.
But what's interesting about that is, several other people that I interviewed said the same thing. When you go to those towns and the Italian people find out you come from there, they just love it, and they really want to be very helpful and help you do your research or help you find your roots, which I think is really great.
Yeah, one thing that I did find, and I've been to several towns in Italy a few times doing research, and it's a mix of, oh my gosh, American cousin, and they're super helpful and they want to show you everything and bring you to the houses where your great-grandparents lived and all that. But at the same time, there's a little lack of curiosity about their own history, because they're so, like, they live it, they're around it, they know it. And I've found that they have found, well, they're very appreciative that we come there to do the history. There's a little, there's a little bit of a, oh, you silly Americani, why do you care so much? And it's like, even the cemeteries, after 100 years or so, they just kind of dump new stones on them, and because they don't, I'm sure that they run out of land and they just keep burying people on top of each other. And but every once in a while, like, there's always somebody in the town that's super into the history, and those are the people you want to find.
They don't do DNA, and I did living DNA because I was figuring it's based in Europe and maybe there'll be some. And then I thought about it and I said, they don't need to do DNA because they know where they come from and they know their grandparents and probably their great grandparents, and it just doesn't seem to be important to them. But I did find one distant cousin over there from my dad's family who's been great and very helpful. And, she kind of rounded up some of the other cousins, and they started sending me, the pictures that they had, and I sent them the pictures that I had. And, the resemblance is uncanny when you see some of it. And especially with my grandmother's father, his name was Piramalo, and that's not a very, very common name. It's originally from Spain, from 1500, and virtually everybody with that name comes from the same family. So it was, and so in some sense too, once I got onto that, it made it easy to track.
You brought up something about the DNA, and everyone knows their history. So I have a fascinating story to share. This isn't about my personal genealogy, but when we lived in Genoa, we made really close friends with some of our Genovese friends whose parents of our daughter's classmates. And last summer, they came to stay with us. Now they're, the wife is half Sicilian, half Piemontese, and the father is 100% Genovese with a little bit of Spain, going back centuries and centuries. And so as a fun gift, I got them the ancestry kit, and they did the test here because they can't do that in Italy, or they couldn't as of last summer. We got the results back, and he shows Native American DNA. No. And he was just astounded because he had always wanted to go to Navajo Nation. And last year he'd always been fascinated with it, which is fascinating in and of itself. But so last summer we did this whole thing with the, Grand Canyon and Southwestern US. And so when he went back to Italy, and I'm like, Nicola, I got your DNA results. And I shared the screen with him and showed him, and he was floored. So the only thing we can figure is that one of his ancestors who were in the shipping business, that they must have been gone over with conquistadors and brought back. There was a history of, natives coming back to Europe and must have brought back a great times how many ever from the 1500s grandmother or something. So anyway, it's just kind of fascinating. So if more Italians did their DNA, there probably would be some surprises.
Yeah, probably. Well, somebody mentioned it to me, and I said, I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to bring a few test kits with me and pass them out to a couple of the cousins. I know from the documentation that we're definitely related, but it would be interesting for that and for them to see also. You spent a lot of time in Italy. You wrote a book about having extended tours there. So what kind of advice would you give to people who want to spend 3, 6, 12 months in Italy?
Yeah, well, I think one of my first bits of advice is always have a personal why, because it's kind of challenging to upend your life and go there for an extended period. So you have to be super motivated. And I think anyone listening to your podcast would already have that why, because that was my why. I want to know the culture of my ancestors. And that kept me going, because no matter what I was going to encounter, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of pain in the butt stuff with Italians when you're there trying to live there legally. But it didn't matter to me, because it got me closer to the culture and the language. So I would say that's one thing that your listeners already have covered. I would say learn Italian, whatever you can do, not because you need it in the cities, but when you go to little villages, a little bit goes a long way. And I think it will be easy enough to find somebody in smaller villages that speak English. But if you can show any kind of, facility with Italian, you're golden. You're like higher up on the welcome scale. And I would say meet people ahead of time as much as you can do that. And there are countless groups, Facebook groups, forums, ancestry forums, local communities where you can weave your way into Italian community. And, you say, oh, I'm going to go to Naples, and somebody's going to know somebody in Naples, and you make those connections. Like I was telling you, when I met the woman who showed us around Castel di Sangro, whose mother was from Capricotta, she was a Facebook connection. I had found a group online that was only about that village, and I joined it, and some were English speakers, some were Italian speakers. And it's like you said earlier, it's just people want to make connections, I think, naturally, especially if they think you're related to them, and that it builds a bridge in advance of you going, and it makes it just 1,000% easier. So those would be my big tips.
And, and I think you're right, because I did a lot of that on Facebook. And, I think to that same end, I've actually found people that I know who either wrote about Italy, spent extended time there. There's Americans there that I found through other friends that either live there or from here. So once you start putting that together, chances are you are going to find somebody. And I think the one thing that I've been able to do, and to your point about the podcast, I've made so many connections over there now, whether it's an author or it's a genealogist or it's a tour person, and they've all been just so helpful. And I know I could call on them at any time. So to your point, join those groups and start making the connections even if you plan to go for a week or 2 weeks.
Oh, yeah, because it will get you that much farther to have somebody in the village say, oh, yeah, I know the librarian. And then because if you just show up, and I've done that before in the past, like 20 years ago, and you walk into the village with your family tree and people don't know what to make of it. And then you walk into the local bar and everyone's there. And you might luck into somebody who wants to say, hey, come over and have dinner or what have you. But if you have anybody in advance to welcome you and set something up, it will save a huge amount of time, especially if you're only going for a couple of days. Because a lot of these churches aren't open except for certain days of the month, and libraries aren't open except for certain days. So you want to time it.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before.
traveling with a scheduled group, or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I did with the specifically the Piramalo cousins. Is I knew they had to be in and around Naples and Circola, and uh, one is in Sorrento. So I just went on Facebook and I searched Piramalo in Naples. And when I found them, I just said, this is my great 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 grandmother or grandfather. Do you have any relation to it? And at first it was slow, but the more we started conversing back and forth, we started making those connections. And um, even before doing any ancestry or any real deep down research, we were able to figure out that we actually probably were related.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Which is just a lot of fun. I mean, I think that's what drives all of us too. Is you find one clue that leads to 10 clues that leads to 100 clues, and you can't let go.
Oh, exactly. And to the point about being related, you go into a village where a grandfather or an ancestor was born, and I can almost guarantee you're related to everybody in that village. Like it's just a matter of doing the trees and the family lines crossing, and there's just no way you're not sharing DNA with everybody there.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I found with my grandmother's family was, and you try to piece things together through historical records, and I'm blessed with that family because there's so much there. But when I was looking at the, one of the charts, I saw that the generation above my great grandparents, there was a Maria Caracciolo who married I think it was Francesco Piramalo. And I said, well, that's strange. I said, there was a wedding in the two families before my grandparents or my great grandparents. And then I kind of started thinking, they were probably at a party someplace. Maybe there's a family gathering with both families. And the one was my great grandfather's uncle, and the other one was my great grandmother's aunt. So I said, maybe there was some kind of big party someplace. You start thinking about these things.
Yeah. Or maybe when they were born, somebody knew somebody and they were like pre-married from birth,
That too. So now you wrote a book about this. So what's in your book and you could give us the name of the book so people can buy it, but what's in that book that are going to guide people along?
So my book is called Let's Leave the Country, A Guide to Your Family You're Abroad. And I wrote it because, I had climbed this mountain to figure out how to get my family over to Italy for a year. Got our kids, registered in public school, figured out how we were going to work remotely, all that stuff. Found housing. That's another thing, by the way, with making connections. Even if you aren't related to somebody, they might know somebody who has housing for you. And if you want a visa, you have to show that you have housing. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to live in a hotel. It's kind of got to be lined up, unless you only want to do 3 months, which you can do as a tourist, much easier. But so we figured out how to do a whole year abroad, which included renting our house. And that allowed us to rent a house in Genoa and, all these little things that come up that you don't realize are going to come up. Oh, health insurance. Oh, what if I need a doctor? What if, all the little boxes you have to check in order to kind of shutter up your life here for a year and then start a life there for a year. So, and then when we came back, people were like, how did you do it? I want to do this. I want to do something like that. I could never do something like that. And I'm like, yeah, you can. It's totally possible. And I wanted to be able to hand people a book, something, so that I didn't have to go through it every time. So that's why I wrote the book. So my book is not exclusively how to live in Italy for a year, although many of the families that I interviewed, just because of who I know, did happen to live in Italy for a year. But there were people that traveled for a year or lived in Asia for a year, and a year is kind of an arbitrary amount of time. But so that's what my book is. It's kind of how to set yourself up emotionally, because it's a daunting task, but totally doable if you have the right frame of mind. So it's kind of a third about that, and then a third about the practicalities of, shuttering up your house and how to figure out how to pay bills and money and, that kind of thing. And then a third of, okay, once you're there, how do you live in another culture? Because we often think, oh gosh, live in Italy for a year, how amazing would that be? And it is amazing, but it's not like a year-long vacation. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have been to Italy, and when you go for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it's a whole different animal than if you're going to live there for a while. So it talks about that as well. And extracting yourself and coming back, which is, again, another animal, the culture shock, returning,
Yeah, we lived in England for 2 years. I didn't have to worry about work or housing or any of that because I worked for Chase, and they took care of everything. I just had to find a house, and everything was taken care of. But to your point, you could visit someplace and it's fun and it's great, and you go to a pub or you go to a restaurant or whatever. But when you live there, it's completely different. It's you because after a while you actually feel like you belong there. I mean, that's your home.
Yeah.
And that's the way we felt. And when we came back, it was like leaving home again.
Yeah. I relate. It was heartbreaking to leave Genoa. And, what's interesting, though, I don't know if you have any English roots or just Italian, but as an Italian American living in Italy for a year, it was this weird identity focus thing. Like, okay, I'm Italian by blood. I belong here, but yet I didn't, but yet I did. But yet I'm American, and I can tell you I've never felt more American than when I lived in Italy for a year. And it was this really strange experience, like kind of having a mirror up, like who are you? How do I identify? And it was fascinating.
Well, yeah, and we lived in Bournemouth. We didn't live in London. We lived in Bournemouth. So if you lived in London, you're American. And there were a lot of Americans around. They were used to having expats, tourists, and all of that. Down in Bournemouth, it was like, oh, you're the Americans.
Yeah, same for us, the Americani. And in Genoa, it's not, now maybe it's more touristy. When we were there a few years ago, it was not very touristy. It's not like living in Florence or Rome where you'd have tons of Americans around you. You were the Americans, and we made a very active choice to not seek out other Americans, because we could have had it probably an easier year psychologically, maybe, if we had only surrounded ourselves with Americans, or more so. But we wanted to immerse in Italian culture, and it harder and yet more rewarding in my experience.
Sure. So how old were your children when you went?
They were in 2nd and 5th grade, and they look back on that year, so fondly. It's so woven into their identity now, and it's great.
Yeah, so I guess at that age it wasn't too bad. I'm friends with somebody wrote. In fact, I'm going to be interviewing him next week or the week after. And he wrote similar thing. He wrote about a book about his experiences there, but his daughters were, I think, 15 and 17 or something like that. And it was like, when you read the book, it's like, I hate you, and why are we here? And I want to go home. But, then as they lived there and they started getting around and they started learning a little Italian, by the end of the book, there was a happy ending and they really enjoyed it and they had Italian friends and they missed it. But he actually, he's actually able to split his time between America and Italy now.
Oh, nice.
A friend of mine from grammar school, she moved there she always wanted to go. She moved there permanently about a year and a half ago now and lives in Salerno. And she loves it. It was a little rough for about 4 or 5 months there, being locked in Italy, locked in a small apartment in Italy. But it seems like things are getting back to normal there a little bit. And they're at least, the restaurants are open because everything revolves around food.
And that's a touristy thing, by the way. We were so surprised because, here we do takeout, we go out a fair amount. I mean, not now, but in Italy, going out is like special occasion, 5-hour thing. It's not, it's a very touristy thing if you're just going out to eat all the time. And we ended up after a while just doing most of our meals and, cooking them ourselves. And our year in Italy actually cost us less than our normal year in the U.S. So,
that's funny you mentioned that because, growing up in the 50s and 60s, I guess even the 70s, we didn't go out to eat. It was like, again, it was a very special occasion. I mean, we go to grandma's every Sunday, but that wasn't going out to eat. But going to restaurants was not something that you did 2, 3, 4 times a week. And we don't do it now because I think I'm a better cook than most restaurants anyway. Maybe.
I'm sure you are. Yeah, I think it became popular in the 80s or something.
So I want to talk a little bit about, you also have a blog, Becoming Better People. So what's that blog about and what kind of advice do you give to people about being better?
Well, my blog kind of was born out of my experience. I kind of viewed our going to Italy, I kind of had zoomed out to who am I? Where do I come from? My family. I wanted to give my daughter some sense of the arc of their humanity, as it were. And then coming back to the U.S., midlife, I turned 50 when we lived there. And it was more like, wow, where are we headed? So I just had a much more global mindset after living at a whole different part of the globe and, again, midlife and kind of, the planet and where, what's going on and all the craziness we're all experiencing now. So I decided to call my blog Becoming Better People. And I've written about Italy, and I write about connect the dots, bigger concept things that connect personal stories like the me to the we. So it's becomingbetterpeople.us, .us, not necessarily US, the country, but sometimes I talk about the country. And it's not necessarily advice, but there's always kind of some great tips. Like this last week, my post is about reframing the apocalypse because I'm in Portland, Oregon right now. And it feels like for like 3 or 4 days, we had orange sky. We couldn't go out. We still can't go out. And it kind of felt like the apocalypse. And I'm like, oh, how do I think about this differently? So I wrote about how I reframed the idea of apocalypse, which does not mean to end times. It actually means a slow unveiling of something new. And I didn't know that. But even looking up a definition, looking up histories of things, just like we do in genealogy, you start, it flips a switch and you see things differently. So that's what my blog is about. And every post that I write, I also like to fuel what I write about with more energy than just the words. So I find a nonprofit that thematically matches whatever I'm writing about, which could be about health, which could be about immigration, what have you. And I find something that I want to support financially, even just a token amount of money, and I highlight them. So that's my blog in a nutshell. And I try to bring in generational stuff when I can. So it is a much broader concept than my book, which is about how to take your family abroad and have that experience for a year. And, my biggest hobby, if I don't get paid, I don't care. I can't help myself. And I don't know if you're like this too, Bob, but somebody says, oh, I don't know my roots. I just know my great grandmother. And I'm like, oh, tell me her name. And I go into Ancestry and it's like a jigsaw puzzle. I can't help myself. it's just so much fun for me. So I think that's the direction that I'm headed with my life, is more stuff of connecting the dots through genealogy and the past, how it directs us towards the present and the future and that sort of thing, which all sounds kind of heady, but I am determined to make it very accessible.
We'll be right back.
Lafayette, we are here. The French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman. Learn all about France's fascinating history, its great characters like Charlemagne, Joan of Arc, Louis XIV, or Napoleon, but also the great events that marked France, Europe, and sometimes the whole world. Lafayette, we're here. Available wherever you get your podcast or on LafayettePodcast.com. À bientôt.
No, I know exactly what you're saying, because I do the same thing. If I'll talk to a friend and I'll ask them, well, they'll say, "How do I get started?" And I go into this whole thing about how you get started and why I get started and why you should do it. And to me, it seems odd that people don't want to know.
I know completely, but there's always like one person in each family that has the curiosity, and you just got to find that one person.
Yeah, and I've mentioned this a few times. I spoke to one person she's like a spiritualist, if I say it right. And I gave her a couple of things. Where I said, I was looking for something, and then I couldn't find anything, and then something happened, or somebody passed away, and all of a sudden it was there. And she said, well, that's because they want to be found. She said, the people in your past and everybody, they want to be found. And, there's some things you could write off as a coincidence. And then there's other things that you just say, it just really isn't a coincidence. There's some other force behind it.
Totally with you there. I've had experiences back before the internet of scrolling, just trying to find a clue and giving up. And then I'm just like, okay, I'm going to scroll and stop and scroll and stop. And on one of my stops, I found her. And it's like, oh my God, it was so beyond coincidence. It was like, okay, she wanted me to find her, So I think we've all been there.
My last interview, she works for Family Search, and she worked for Ancestry first. And she was young. And when she first went there, she said there was only about, I don't think she said 50 people working in Ancestry at the time. I think she said it was 1999. And they said, well, let us show you where we do the filming and, some of the films that we have. And, the person taking around said, well, look through here and, you'll see what we're doing. And she looked through the viewer, and it was the parish from her grandmother's family. Isn't that weird?
Yes and no. I mean, there's so many stories like this. It's not so weird. It's amazing.
And one other person told me that she found somebody through Facebook that never knew her. She lived in a town or near the town where her family was from. They became friends, and she said, "If you come to Italy, I'm going to take you to the town." And she would, she did all of that and started her own business from that. But the most interesting thing was she had found out that I think it was her great-grandmother, had no children. And when she passed away, she left her land and her home or homes to another family. And she said, I was looking for a place to stay, like a B&B or something like that. And I kept searching around. I narrowed it down to 2. I went eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I picked this one. And when I called, because it was in such a small town and everything, the person said, what are you coming, why are you coming here? And she said, well, my family's from here, and this is their last name. And she said, hold on, I'm going to go get my mother. She got her mother, and this was the family that her great-grandmother left the land to.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So, you can't make that up, and it just can't be a coincidence.
Yeah. It's funny. I met a person in a forum. This is before Facebook, that had the same last name as my mother, and and he said, "Oh, well, if you ever come to Italy, and lo and behold, in 2010, when we had a toddler and a younger daughter, we made a trip, and I'm like, Luigi, we're coming. Can we visit?" And he's like, "Oh, of course, of course." I bring the family tree, and all we knew is that we had a surname in common. And we visit his house, and his wife had gotten her great aunt's research and brought it down from the attic, and we matched up as third cousins.
Wow.
Yeah. So we now are friends, and I've hosted their daughter when she came to the U.S. to learn English, and we saw them when we lived there. We stayed in the village that we come from. There's this big castle, and she inherited the property that my great grandfather lived in.
Really?
So
wow.
Yeah, because it just goes Italian law. You just get it, and everyone has and everybody had left that village. Most of them had gone to Wales. My ancestors had gone to Chicago. And it was the summer when they all come back, all the descendants who inherited all these little properties come back, and they stay in Italy for the summer. So we hung out when we first arrived for our year there. And it was lovely meeting all these people that you're related to somehow. Welsh and British, and there were some Germans, and we were the Americans. And it was amazing. It's like these little connections. And it was so coincidental that I met him on an online forum, and that it just so happened that his wife, we come from the same great-great-grandparents. And we were looking through photos in the house, and I was like, "Wait, I have that photo," and it's so cool. So, and this is not an uncommon story. Oh, I was going to say, any of your listeners that decide they're going to do this and go to their ancestral village, I can almost guarantee they will have some kind of story to tell afterwards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And same thing with the picture exchange with my cousins over there. I got one photo of somebody, and while he didn't look exactly like my father, there's definitely a family resemblance. But one of, I think she's a fourth cousin. I saw this. She posted it, or it was a Facebook photo, whatever, and I could not believe how much. I mean, she looked like my cousin Susan's exactly. I mean, if you put the two pictures next to each other, you would say you could almost say they were twins. That's how much they looked alike at the same age. When people get older, they seem to look a little bit different, but they must have both been in like 21 or 22, and they looked exactly alike.
Oh, that's amazing.
So it's really something. Well, I do appreciate you taking the time. This has been fun. It's always fun for me. I love doing these kinds of things. My wife says, you're talking to somebody else again today? Stop bothering those people.
No, it's totally fun. Well, and I don't know, I had sent you a link just because I'm happy to offer people help. And I have like I said, anyone who plans to go to Italy, language, learning it. So I have my language learning tips from decades of making mistakes and figuring out kind of my best practices. And from our year in Italy, and from several times that we've traveled, I also created a little ebook of, personal recommendations. So any of your listeners who go to my webpage can get that if they would like.
Okay, great. And and I'll post all those links on the blog that's connected to the podcast and the video, and I'll put them on the YouTube too, so people can find them easily.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, and stay safe out there with the fires and COVID and everything else that's going on. It's been crazy this year.